In the first confrontation of the Cold War, the Soviets sought to choke the Americans and the Allies out of Berlin by enclosing the city with a blockade under Stalin's iron fist. With all the roads, waterways, and rails cut off, the Americans had few options but to surrender the city or risk World War III. Instead, they dared the impossible and sought to use the open airways to supply a city of 2.5 million people with food, fuel, and most of all, hope. By not backing down, they risked war, and what was much more likely a failure to complete its mission. But after over a year of non-stop flights landing nearly every single minute, it was clear the blockade failed, leaving Stalin and the Soviets with much more than egg on their faces. But why would America sacrifice so much for one city that was, just a couple years earlier, home to its darkest enemies? Well, that's just a treasure we're out to discover. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. At the end of World War II, America stood triumphant over a shattered world as one of the two superpowers left standing. Its wartime ally, the Soviet Union, was the only other superpower left standing, though they had suffered tremendously from the war. At the end of the war in 1945, when American troops entered Berlin from the west and the Soviets came in from the east, they met and embraced like long-lost brothers. They hugged, sang, and drank to toppling Hitler and to victory. Andy Rooney, the wartime writer for the Stars and Stripes, wrote after the two armies met in April of 1945, "The Russian soldiers are the most carefree bunch that ever came together in an army. They would best be described as exactly like Americans, only twice as much. You get the feelings of exuberance, a great new world opening up." But the promise of a beautiful new world to arise from the ashes of the last quickly went up in smoke when the different post-war visions of the Americans and the Soviets began to surface. Their differences could be oversimplified as America being democratic capitalism and the Soviets being authoritarian communism, two ideologies or belief systems that were entirely opposed to one another. Being the sole superpowers in the world, a Cold War developed and lasted for over 4 decades. This Cold War was a competition for global power, positioning, and prestige. And it's cold not because Russia is cold, really, really cold. Right, Napoleon? Right, Hitler? But it's considered cold because the two powers miraculously never fought directly, but rather competed for power in many other ways, like a space race and an arms race, and to control the developing nations of the world, and even in sports. Though we will see in Berlin, the first heating of the Cold War arose, and it brought it nearly to a breaking point. But lest we go any further, our exploration question for today's story lecture is, what developments led to the Berlin Airlift, and why did America risk so much for one city? So use that as a frame to understand the many moving parts in the story. What caused it and why did Berlin matter so much? Okay, to first understand the Berlin Airlift, we have to start with a little geography. At the Yalta Conference at the end of World War II, it was agreed that Germany would be divided between the Soviets, who would control the East, and West Germany, which would be divided between the US, Britain, and France. To complicate things further, Berlin, the capital of Germany, would also be divided in much the same way. Now, this is essential to understand. Berlin was located about 100 miles into the Soviet-controlled section of East Germany. America knew that a strong and stable Germany would be essential for the rebuilding of Europe, which is exactly what Stalin feared. Said the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, "What happens to Berlin happens to Germany. What happens to Germany happens to Europe." Seeing why Berlin might be important? And the Soviets, after having been invaded twice that century by German troops, wanted to ensure Germany was weak, paralyzed, and dependent on the Soviets. Although this worried America, they could do very little about it. With only about 98,000 troops in Berlin, the Soviets had over 1.5 million. Then, the Allies worried the Soviets when they unified their 3 separate sections of West Germany into one, and they looked to do the same in Berlin. Even more threatening to Stalin was the Deutsche Mark, a new and more stable currency that the Allies were introducing to stabilize the German economy. Because you see, on the black market throughout Berlin, cigarettes were the true currency, as money was nearly worthless. But the Deutsche Mark could strengthen and stabilize the country, and Stalin would not let that happen. So, on June 24th, the Soviets closed down the Autobahn that connected West Berlin and the Allied-controlled West Germany for permanent repairs. Then they closed off all the waterways and the rail traffic. Cut off from the outside, the Allied forces in Berlin would soon run out of supplies and would be forced to surrender control of the city. This was the first great test of the Cold War. Would Truman and the Americans give in to Soviet pressure? Would they surrender a city that they had supported? Or would they strike back with their military? But Truman would not risk pulling the nation into another war. The only thing open to the Allies was the airways, 3 narrow air corridors into Berlin. But it seemed impossible to supply a city of 2.5 million with food, coal, medical supplies, and other necessities, and Stalin and the Americans knew it. The commanding American general in Berlin, General Lucius D. Clay, was a genius organizer, a man of steel will and supreme confidence. And when the blockade was drawn, he asked the Air Force commander if his planes would be capable of supplying coal to the city day in and day out. The Air Force commander said, "General, we can haul anything." Clay then wrote to Washington about the absolute importance of saving Berlin, stating, "There is no practicality in maintaining our position in Berlin, and it must not be evaluated on that basis. We are convinced that our remaining in Berlin is essential to our prestige in Germany and Europe. Whether for good or bad, it has become a symbol of American intent." What Clay was highlighting was that America's name, our word, our bond, was attached to maintaining a free West Berlin, and therefore giving in meant more than just losing a city. It displayed American weakness for all the world to see. Truman said plainly, "We will stay, period." And at the same time, events outside Berlin were only raising the stakes for global superiority in the Cold War. When it became clear that there would be a struggle with the Soviets over the future of the world order, there was a debate in Washington on how to respond when a telegram arrived from an American diplomat in Moscow. George Kennan's long telegram suggested a strategy for dealing with the Soviets that became known as the Containment Policy. This became the backbone of America's foreign policy throughout the entire Cold War. In the telegram, Kennan argued that vigilant and consistent pressure against Soviet aggression was needed in order to contain communism, and that if the Soviets were shown strong resistance and a willingness to use military muscle, it would rarely need to be used. Winston Churchill echoed this call in his Iron Curtain speech just a few weeks later. He said that a metaphorical Iron Curtain divided the free people of Europe with those under communist domination, and that it needed to be resisted or that curtain would sweep across the rest of the continent. Truman would face his first test of the Containment Doctrine in Turkey and Greece, 2 countries battling communist revolutions and insurrections, and 2 countries that also remind me a lot of Thanksgiving. So, Truman got Congress to provide millions of dollars in economic and military aid for these countries, which successfully held the communists at bay. Announcing the Truman Doctrine in March of 1947, he pledged America's support for free people all over the world who were resisting communism. Therefore, though this was directed towards Greece and Turkey specifically, the Truman Doctrine put the whole world in America's new sphere of influence. It was a formal announcement of America stepping up as a global power. Though the war had been over for 2 years, the people across Europe were struggling to survive, their countries in ruins, economies crippled, shelter and security scarce, and survival uncertain. You gotta realize these are the perfect conditions for communism to spread, and America again was forced to act. So America passed the Marshall Plan, which was the largest aid package in human history, which gave billions of dollars to rebuild Europe. Within 5 years, the nations of Western Europe were not just rebuilding, but beginning to prosper, which was a stark contrast to the poverty on the dark side of the Iron Curtain. But with Berlin behind that Iron Curtain, Marshall Plan aid and everything needed just to survive was closed off to land and sea, leading America and the Allies to take to the air. The Soviets were fully convinced, and so were many American military leaders, that the airlift was doomed from the start. Even if it was only necessary for a few months, the chances seemed slim. Clearly there was no roadmap, or air map, to follow. Nevertheless, General Clay called for dozens upon dozens of cargo planes to supply the 2.5 million Berliners. These planes became the workhorses of what was known as Operation Vittles, what we call the Berlin Airlift. Truman also sent Britain several B-29 bombers, the planes used to carry atomic bombs in case war came. During the first week, they struggled to adequately supply the city, providing just 90 tons a day, though they knew many more times that would be needed. By the second week, Clay, working with dozens of other technicians and thousands of people on the ground, had improved it to over 1,000 tons each day. With each day they improved, though challenges continued to confront them. As flights increased, so too did the likelihood of collision. And then they perfected the stacked aircraft, which were flying schedules with each plane about 1,000 feet higher than the one in front of it, because at its peak, a plane landed and took off every 30 seconds. Throughout the year-long effort, pilots, air traffic controllers, and support crews worked at a ferocious pace, often barely having time to stop to eat at terminals or have a proper night's sleep. Despite this, there was hardly any crashes and no deaths from flying accidents, though 101 Americans and Brits did die during the effort. And can I pause for just a second and tell you how strange this all is in the larger context? Just 2 years earlier, American planes were making similar daily flights over Germany, but were dropping thousands of bombs on their cities. Now some of those same pilots are flying over essential supplies, risking their lives and war against their previous ally to save Germany and its capital. Some Americans were pretty ill at ease about all this, being how flipping crazy it all is. But within time, the Berliners would win over the hearts and minds of the American people. Those living in Berlin faced intense pressures and daily struggles to survive. Even with 1,500 flights a day supplying the city, food, fuel, and goods were in short supply. And a few months into the airlift, a Soviet mob invaded City Hall and attempted a takeover of the government, but it failed, and it unified many Berliners to be more strongly opposed to the Soviets. Protesters tore down Soviet flags in front of tens of thousands of Soviet troops, and a storm of 500,000 Berliners marched to Brandenburg Gate to stand up in protest together. As one saying went, it's cold in Berlin, but colder in Siberia. Their resistance and courage to stand up in protest fostered greater solidarity between the Germans and the Americans, which further ensured that America would not abandon them throughout the entirety of the Cold War. And within the airlift, there were many little miracles and hero stories. U.S. pilot GAIL HALVORSEN had some rare free time after one of his drops and went exploring around a little bit when he came upon about 30 kids in a nearby town, and they began exchanging stories. And before he left, he realized he had 2 pieces of gum in his pocket. But when they promised to share, he ripped the pieces in half and handed it through the fence. The kids unwrapped the gum, and they passed it around and held the paper and foil to their noses and breathed in as if it was the greatest treat in the world. He promised on his next flight when he passed overhead, he would drop candy for them and would wiggle his wings so that they could recognize him as he approached. They started to call him Uncle Wiggle Wings, as day in and day out the candy bomber unloaded special treats for the town kids. Eventually, 23 tons of chocolate were dropped, giving Berliners something more than just the bare necessities, because one can live without freedom for a while, but it's a heck of a lot easier if you got chocolate and chewing gum. About 9 months in, on Easter Sunday, as General Clay was sitting down to enjoy a dessert of blueberry pie, he listened to the steady roar of planes going and returning from Berlin, and he said, I think we licked 'em. By the spring, it was clear that the blockade had failed, and every day that the airlift succeeded, it demonstrated America's strength and commitment and further humiliated Stalin and the Soviets. So finally, on May 11, 1948, nearly 11 months since it was first imposed, the Autobahn, rails, and waterways reopened, and West Berlin was free. Operation Vittles continued through September to further supply the city in case the blockade was reimposed, but it never was. The Berlin Airlift was the first major confrontation of the Cold War, and played differently by either the Soviets or the Americans, it could have well led to the opening shots of World War III. But in the end, a hot war was averted. Recognizing the importance of a strong alliance and unity in the face of future Soviet aggression, America, Canada, and 10 Western European nations formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance based on mutual defense. An attack against one, as Truman stated, was attack against all. And in that way, the airlift accomplished the total opposite of Stalin's intentions. Hoping to break the Allied powers apart, it unified them and showed the world America would stand up for and spend its treasure and its blood for its allies. And the willingness to starve out civilians to achieve their goals, the Soviets were vilified across the world. While Berlin, long a symbol of Prussian militarism and then Nazism, became a symbol of democracy and freedom, a lone island of light and hope behind the Iron Curtain. And I hope that history can show us and lead us to understand that some things are worth fighting for, but brute force is not always the best and most useful way to do so. Maybe we can apply that lesson to our own lives and the history that's unfolding in front of us. So, thanks for engaging in history today. This has been History for Humans. But now what you've all been waiting for. Dad jokes in history! Why did the Soviets take so long to end the blockade? Because they kept stalling. Alright, and if you like this episode, please click and show it. It's like a small donation that costs you nothing but helps me, a teacher, keep making these videos. And subscribe if you want to, and stay posted when new episodes drop. And if you comment below, please do so with respect and integrity and thoughtfulness. And head over to our website and you can engage with conversations with students from around the country. And if you're doing the learning activity, hang out for just a moment because we got instructions coming up next. Okay guys, you're going to be dancing with the dead in today's lesson. That's right, you're going to be reading and analyzing images from the past, those delicious primary sources. The big overall question is, how did the Berlin Airlift impact the Cold War? And as you view each of the 4 documents, consider that question. Most are images, cartoons, photographs, and a map, but there is a newspaper article for you to read as well. But think critically as you analyze each one, answer the questions thoughtfully, and then what you're going to do is you're going to put it all together and build a short argument, answering how did the Berlin Airlift impact the Cold War? Develop an original claim, put together important evidence from the documents, and then provide your reasoning, which means to explain the significance of the evidence that you gave. Okay, and I want you to act like fighter pilots on this one and drop some knowledge bombs.